The prayer of the lowly pierces the clouds. That's verse 21 of Sirach, chapter 35. I am already being poured out like a libation. That's verse 6. Second letter of Timothy, chapter 4. Jesus, though God, emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 7. And I may be paraphrasing a little bit. So in these three readings, I'm kind of understanding that when we approach God, are we open and receptive to him? If we're not open and liberated and free of these other concerns or ego, pride, selfishness, then that's really not a true prayer or a form of communication with God, because we're not allowing ourselves to listen and receive God, which is the point of prayer, is to approach God and yes, speak our minds, but at the same time, because it's a communication, we have to also then listen to what God has to say. And we can't do that if we're full of things inside.
One really basic and hugely important truth about all of our connection with the divine is that God initiates it and we respond. But we're so used to achievement and doing that in sequential ways that it becomes, I think, difficult for us to really be receptive. And then riffing off that same phrase in Sirach, the prayer of the lowly pierces the clouds, reminds me of a classic work of spirituality called The Cloud of Unknowing. And in that work, if you plow through it enough, a point is our prayer has to pierce the cloud to reach the divine. But it isn't because the divine is so obscure and the divine puts the cloud there. It's our doing. So we can remove it as much as is true that we put it there. But our receptivity is secondary to God's initiative towards us, which is always there, no matter how we respond, or in fact, if we respond, because all people don't. And our response or lack of it doesn't change God's initiative towards us. I heard somebody say, I believe in God, but I'm a free person. And I believe that no matter what I do, God is going to love me anyway. So I just go through life, no holds barred. And I thought to myself, what an interesting mix of things, because the fact that God's initiative towards people never stops is an absolute truth. But the fact that it positions that person in such a non-receptive way is, I think, indicative of people as a whole, which is deeply sad, I think.
I was seeing the physical description that was happening between the tax collector and the Pharisee. So the first thing I noticed, it said two people went up to the temple area. So I saw the metaphor. These two individuals were setting their sight, their bodies towards encountering God. So in that one sense, they both had at least that initial approach correct. Then the second thing I noticed is it said the Pharisee took up his position. And I think some translations have it as he stood up to God. And then when you kind of compared that with the tax collector, it said the tax collector stood up at a distance and would not even raise his eyes to heaven. So I think some imagery I kind of saw was, his head was down, probably on his knees. That's obviously extrapolating too much out of it. But just that kind of idea, based on what you were just saying, is that sometimes we can start off in a correct idea, but we can end up turning it to benefit us and our ego. And so in comparison to what you're saying, we can kind of say, yes, God is always there, always forgiving, always merciful. But then we turn it about ourselves and we say, therefore I can do as I choose, as I please. But that's kind of overlapping with what the parable of the gospel is saying, is that the Pharisee had the right intent, but just at the end still reverted to thinking about himself.
I think significant is the Pharisee wasn't a bad guy. He did everything he was supposed to do. I think that the problem is when he said, I'm not greedy, I'm not dishonest, I'm not adulterous, I fast twice a week, I pay tithes on my whole income. all of that is supposed to be a response to realizing God's love for us. So therefore we do these things, then to think of them as achievements. Well, I've done all this and therefore I deserve a connection with the divine. One way to look at this parable is the Pharisee named all the ways he was a good Pharisee. I'm not greedy. I'm not dishonest. I'm not adulterous. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes on my income. But he didn't use that to connect himself with the rest of humanity. He used it to separate himself from that. I think there's also an ongoing danger of thinking that we might have a corner on the market of connection to the divine because of our spirituality, our devotion, the way we live, what we avoid and what we embrace. And that's always a danger because we've said this so many times, the trajectory of God is always moving towards communion and inclusion. Positive religious devotional ways of acting are always a response to first being loved instead of something that earns me that love. And if you can feel that the initiative is always God's, then you don't have to be a counter, and you don't have to hold things tight. You do things and you wouldn't change because you want to protect this connection, which is who you are. You want to protect that. So I'll be faithful in doing that because that's what I understand in God's initiative of love coming first.
I was thinking how the last line, the latter went home justified, not the former. But it doesn't conclude the story for them. It just gives me the idea that next day, what would happen? Well, the following day, will the Pharisee kind of have a change of heart? Will the tax collector continue his receptivity and opening up for God's mercy? What this highlights for me is that just like ourselves, we may confess our sins. We may kind of have a moment in prayer where we truly open up ourselves. That does not negate the fact that we may still sin again the following day, the following week, the next hour. And the point is to always continually approach God in a certain manner because God will forgive us and give us and be merciful to us. But we need to continue practice this openness. The Pharisee is a sinner, tax collector sinner, and we are a sinner as well. So even ourselves, we shouldn't even look down on the Pharisees. The focus should be on, let us all make sure we're always focusing on ourselves and being receptive to God. We're all sinners, and tomorrow we may again have something else to acknowledge how we fell short, and we need to again repeat that process.
You shift the whole thing, the focus. When you say the parable really isn't about the tax collector or the Pharisee, the parable's about God. If we say that this parable is really about God, then the focus is on, again, God's initiative. And are we serious about that love that gives us our existence in a regular way? Are we receptive to it at all? Do we act on the realization of it?
Last week, the gospel reading focused on the persistent widow, being persistent in prayer. And I think this week's reading adds to it in emphasizing the fact that we have to be persistently asking for mercy and forgiveness, humble ourselves in speaking to God. It takes us continually acknowledging our shortcomings.
Persistence is its own kind of faithfulness. It really is. And that's what Jesus' prayer of the Orthodox people, in which they use the needs to pray over and over again, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. That's just not a quirky function of a personality of somebody in the early days of the Orthodox faith. That was built on, I think, a deep and profound recognition of mercy and this response to it by just repeating it over and over and over again so that it would possibly get to your heart, and then you could live out of that realization.
The Pharisee's prayer wasn't completely off in a sense. If we take away the ego-centered language, His prayer, if I just take out those parts, actually pretty good. It says, "Oh God, I thank you that I am not greedy, dishonest, adulterous, and I thank you for being able to fast twice a week, be able to pay tithes on my whole income." You know, it's a little nuance, but I feel like sometimes we're trying to say something well, we can shift the focus easily and make it about someone else, and therefore devalue or lose the point of the prayer.
You're absolutely right, I think, because if you think about those practices like fasting twice a week, paying tithes, but if you think about it, paying tithes and fasting are acts of love, right? I want you to have it. I love you. That's what it is. Yeah, I fast because this is how much I love you, God. I want this connection to be so strong that I am hyper alert to it. I mean, you can fast for lots of different reasons, but one reason can be a purification. And that's in lots of cultures and faiths, isn't it? You fast because I don't ever want to lose the intensity of understanding how much you love me. Or I pay the tithes because look how much you've given me. I'm not living on the streets, and I don't exist unto myself. And so I want to do something for the people with whom I am connected because you love everybody. You know, those practices originated out of love. Ideally, though, you do it freely and out of love. They're good things.
Going back to this parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee, we could just look at them and say, oh, there are two people praying and they're both holy people and God approves both of them because they're in church, they're in the temple. But only God knows. And it's in those nuances which God knows of other people and of ourselves where our heart is, where's our mind and spirit is at. So it's small things, the inner heart, inner self things that make the difference.
And look for how many people it's not enough to know in yourself. It's important that it be recognized and that you not be misunderstood. I think it takes a certain confidence, faith in God, and trust in yourself not to care about what other people think. Do you remember when we were taught whatever you do to one side of the equation, you have to do to the other? Well, I think we treat life like that. It has to be balanced like that, measurable like that, mathematic like that. But the truth is, we're dealing with mystery that can't be nailed down to something final because, well, the whole idea of trajectory of God, the whole idea of development, the whole idea of fullness that's gathering in our responding to what we begin to recognize about the divine, that can't fit into containers. So that's what I mean by mystery. But we tend to like things definite.
Only God is a true judge. We're not God and we can't be the judge of others, which is what the Pharisee was doing. He was judging or passing judgment on the tax collector. So if the Pharisee was the judge, at the end of the story, the tax collector is not the justified one, based on human understanding, human way of thinking. But God is the judge. This parable is, or Jesus revealing, God's judgment is the tax collector is justified and not the Pharisee. And so embedded in this is the idea that how dare we try to pass judgment on others because we are in no position to be the judge. So we can't take that elevated position and look down on other people because we are just like them.
And we do that a lot. The basic realization to beginning a spiritual life, a life of prayer, a life of religious practice is God and I'm not. And that sounds so flip, but that's a pretty big thing to feel in your spirit. Holiness is an attribute that only belongs to God. If anybody acts in a holy way, it is because they received some of that holiness from God. But it belongs to God rightly. It doesn't belong to anybody else.
And I think that goes back to what I started with, because God himself showed us what God is like, where Jesus, although God, emptied himself and became one of us. And so that's the pattern. We were thinking we want to be high and powerful. And so therefore, that's why we want to judge others, because in judging others, we think we can elevate higher. But God's saying, no, that's not power, nor is that anything divine. Divine is emptying yourself like the tax collector of all your pride, of all your ego, as Jesus did, and taking that lowly stance of a servant to serve others.
The basic movement of the divine is just what you said, emptying self.